Okay, so what story are we hearing today?
Yeah, well, it's early September, and Anita's out here in Spring Green, and I had fun. I think she had fun last time when we did some storytelling, and I'm finding that just to be as as valuable to me as anything. I think there's can be lots of stories. So I've been thinking about a man named Trevor Leggett, who was British. He's dead many years now, but really had a huge influence on the early days of my Zen training because of his writing. I knew him through his books that he wrote about Zen and the ways in Japan, but then had three wonderful opportunities to meet him in London as we were working on publishing projects for Omori Sogen's book, Sanzen Numon. And he was instrumental in helping us to find a publisher, and then ended up writing an introduction. And I just found him tremendously warm and gracious to sit with him. He knew something of Zen training himself, but primarily he was a judo man and had trained as a young man in Japan when he was early there for the BBC, and sort of caught the last remnants of the really great, severe judo training that was available in Japan. And for many years, when he went back to England, he was the highest ranked judo man outside of Japan and was revered as a teacher. So he trained through his body the way we do. And he knew Omori Sogen. They had crossed paths several times in Japan. So this story has to do with the idea of Shugyo, which is a Japanese word. And we translate that as spiritual forging. And even if I say that, there's sort of this fist and this heroic impulse that comes across me, because we know the Shugyo stories of the swordsman and Teshu and Omori Sogen himself and my teacher Greene Roshi, and we just sort of get this certain to our face, and it's just like Shugyo, forging, the hardest, most severe forms of training. But the story from Mr. Leggett gave me a different perspective on Shugyo, and that's the story I want to tell. And I can't locate it in time. It's just something that happened in the way that he told the story. But it has to do with the shakuhachi, playing the shakuhachi, the Japanese bamboo flute. And it started with a Japanese man who had traveled to China. This is, I'm certain, many centuries ago. And he himself was a master of the shakuhachi, but he encountered a Chinese teacher who had developed a new form of the bamboo flute. And this man was just entranced. He felt it took it far beyond what he had known before. And so he spent as much time as he could with this Chinese master, ultimately returned to Japan, bringing many of these new types of flutes, but also a knowledge of how to make more of them. So this was an innovation being brought to Japan. And he lived in Tokyo, he taught in Tokyo, but he also would take time to travel in different parts of the country where he thought there would be people who were interested. And as with many things in Japan, when it comes to something like one of these fine arts, there could be a local guild. It'd be like just a group of people who are passionate about, in this case, the shakuhachi. And they're all amateurs, some young, some old, some quite masterful, others awkward but sincere. But you can kind of picture, he used the word guild for this kind of collection of people. And so there was such a guild. and he went to their town at their invitation and did a performance using this new kind of flute. And as often happens after experiencing great music, there's just an easy silence that takes place after the last note fades away. Just a sensation of time has stopped and let me absorb all this that just happened. But then the oldest member of this guild at a certain point broke the quiet, saying, like a god, was his commentary on what he had just experienced. So this Japanese master was scheduled to leave the next day. And before he left, the guild members had already decided amongst themselves, but two of them as representatives went to him and they said, if we could present to you a suitable student and sufficient funds to enable them to support themselves while they're training with you, would you accept such a person at our recommendation? And he said yes. And they said, well, how long would it take? And he said, well, for somebody who already is highly proficient in what you guys know as the shakuhachi, it would take most likely 3 years. And so the guild agreed that they would select one of their young members, but somebody who was just, his trajectory was way beyond what they felt any of them could accomplish. And he was the one that they wanted to select to send off to study with his teacher. The arrangements were made, the teacher agreed, this young man from the guild agreed, and off he set with the blessings of his guild. So he settled into training with this teacher. And at first there was just many, many months of work on technique, and technique across the full spectrum of senses and use of the body. So how he would sit, how he would walk in terms of the sensitivity of his feet on the ground. Obviously how he would breathe, how he would use his fingers, but not just his fingers, but where did the work come from that made the fingers work as they did, whether they were fast or slow or firm or soft. Tremendous amount of technical detail. And he bit into that. And then it got to a point in his training with his teacher where there was just simply one piece of music that he was assigned. And play this, and only this, and only this. This is the only thing I want to hear from you. And so he would dutifully come and present himself to the teacher, clear his throat, settle his body in the way he had learned to settle in his body, and he would get into play. Sometimes his playing would last a minute. Sometimes it could last 20 minutes. It didn't matter. At any given point, the master would interrupt him and say, something's missing. And that's all he would say. He wouldn't say what was missing. He didn't say what to do about it missing. He just said something's missing. So day after day, only this piece, something's missing, something's missing. And as you can imagine, he got so frustrated. He knew the technique. He had been already so well trained before he met the master, and then he had soaked up everything he could learn about technique with his new flute. But it wasn't enough. As any of us might, he said, "Well, listen. Maybe the problem's the piece. Can I blow another piece? another piece of music. Then I'll show you what I know. The master said, nope, I only want this piece. Something's missing, something's missing. It drove the young man to despair. Nothing was changing, nothing was changing, nothing was changing. He knew he was there because of the support of his hometown guild. He knew it was their money that was supporting him. He knew that the teacher was teaching him with the best he had, and yet he felt so inadequate. I simply am not good enough, and I can't continue to waste the support from my guild. So one night he just packed his things and snuck away. No farewell, no note, no anything. He just left. He ended up in he rented a little apartment in that town, and would occasionally, pick up his new flute, and occasionally would blow. But he was well trained enough by now in his own sensation. He knew something's missing, something's missing, something's missing. Now it was his own voice, not his teacher's voice. Something's missing. Nothing changes, nothing changes. And to comfort himself, there was more and more sake. More and more sake. That was the only thing which he could just sort of blank out his sense of despair and failure. And pretty soon the money was gone. He had no money left. He couldn't go back to his guild without a certificate of completing his training. That would be more shameful than anything. But the only place he'd ever known and lived was that hometown. So he begged a little hut from a farmer in that area, little work shed, tool shed that wasn't being used, and that's where he lived. And he would scrounge for vegetables, and sometimes he'd get a fish out of the stream. And sometimes he would pick it up and blow that damn flute. But it was just more and more helpless. He had completely failed in his training. He had failed these guild members who had supported him. He had no other prospects. His whole life had been devoted to the shakuhachi. It wasn't like he had another trade or job or skill set that he could draw upon. He just had failed. So there came a day when two of the guild members were not looking for him. They had heard farmers tell of the sound of a flute coming, from up around this area, up around these fields. And they wondered that it might be him, because they had heard nothing. Once he had left his teaching master, there was simply no communication. They could learn nothing about his whereabouts or what had happened or why or how. So one of them was the old man of the guild, the senior member, and then somebody who was young enough to help him get over the fences and work their way to this particular field, this particular hut, and they found him. And when they saw him, at first nobody said anything. They just sort of sat quietly, enjoying the air. But at some point, the old man spoke up and he said, tomorrow is our annual celebration where we invite people from the town, we invite guests, we invite visitors, family members, anyone who loves music. We gather and we play our best. We want you to come. We want you to play. There's no past. There's nothing to say about what's happened. There's nothing we need to say about you as a shakuhachi player. We simply want you to be there. And if you won't come, we won't hold our celebration this year because it's simply too sad to think of all that you absorbed that we can't hear. And the young man shook his head and said, you ask what's impossible. But because you ask, I will come. And the next day, in the dirtiest, rattiest looking clothes, he's been living in a hut for months and months and months. But he had brought one of these new flutes that he had been introduced to. And he felt like he was sort of in a dream, in a daze. He didn't have a plan. He just didn't have anything. From our point of view, it would just be like a very deep samadhi. And he was sitting way off to the side. He didn't want to interact with anyone. He didn't want to look at anyone. He didn't want anybody talking to him. He sat off to the side. But at a certain moment, as each of the people had come up to play, sometimes by themselves, sometimes together, the old man gestured. Come, come. Again, not knowing what to do, he simply picked up his shakuhachi and went and sat. Maybe not just as I'm sitting here. And as I said, he had no plan, but the notes that he knew without even thinking about it was that damn piece of music that had never been good enough for his teacher. And so, with the sensation of absolutely nothing to lose, that was the piece that he began to blow. I can almost hear it. And then there was that last note, and it's almost, especially with shakuhachi, it's like it goes as the breath goes, and the breath is getting less and less, so the note is getting less and less, but still there's something to this finish, and then silence, almost the deepest form of silence. And as he had said once before, the old man was the man who broke the silence. And said like a god. So I tell this story because not all, and maybe not most, experiences of Shugyo are heroic in the way that we like to tell the stories. There's students I know who feel like they've stepped away from their Zen training for many years. And yet it hurts them. It's that same sensation of that young man. I failed. And what's amazing to me as a teacher is how readily I see that experience as a continuation and a deepening of their training. In their mind, they're not training. In that young man's mind, he was no longer trying to learn how to play a new shakuhachi. He was simply in this pit of inadequacy. That pit, that sensation, is as strong and rich a form of what we call Shugyo as any that I know. Because basically everything has been stripped away. All sensation of habit, all sensation of identity, all sensation of accomplishment has simply been stripped, and there's nothing left. If you can go there with something you care about so deeply, that's Shugyo.